Hi, hello, Happy New Year. Our first story is going to be The Lady of the Lake, illustrated by our lovely Sarah and told by me, Colin. Now this first story is not going to be technically brilliant as the next ones are going to be because we've had a bit of recording problem for this. But it's the story that counts, not the quality. So without further ado, I'll tell you this story. There was a farm. In the farm was a young man, Owen, and his mother. They lived together there. They had some livestock. They weren't rich by any means at all. But they had cattle, and it was Owen's job every day to take the cattle to pasture. And one of his favourite places to go was on a field by the lake. And the lake was so big that if you had never left your village or your town, you might imagine on a particularly windy day as the waves came in, that it was the sea. And one day he was sitting just about lunchtime to eat the bread and cheese that every day his mother gave him, when he looked out on the lake, and there, sitting on a rock, was the most beautiful woman. She was stunning. She was so beautiful that it's beyond the finest storyteller in the world to describe her. And without thinking, he held out the loaf of bread as though this would tempt her towards him. And she did. She seemed to walk on the water. She came within a touching distance of him. She looked at the bread and said, "A hard bread like that is never going to win me." And she turned and she walked slowly down, until she disappeared. And he was besotted. He went back, he told his mother all about it, and he said, "I must woo her, I must win her." And she said, well, if she doesn't like hard bread, we'll give her uncooked bread, just the dough, and that might tempt her. And he hardly had any sleep that night, and he woke in the dawn the next day, and he took this sticky dough and he took it to the lakeside. And as the cows grazed, he looked. And as the mist disappeared and the lake came into sharp view, there was nothing. And he sat there all day and he thought, it's not going to happen, is it? And so he got up to go, and as he did, he looked, and out the corner of his eye he saw on a different rock the same woman. And he held out this sticky dough, and she went and she said, well, something that soft is never going to win me, is it? And she turned and walked back down, and she disappeared in the water. And he was beside himself. He went back, he talked to his mother, and his mother said, "I tell you what, we'll go and see Granny, because she bakes the finest bread in this entire district." And so they did. And Granny baked a loaf of bread, and he got no sleep that night at all. Before dawn, he was back at the lake with the cows and this bread. And it started to drizzle and mizzle and spot with rain until he was soaked through, but he would not move. It was getting dark. And again, he gave up hope. And then he noticed that 3 of the cows seemed to be walking on the water of the lake. And as he went towards them, out of the water came his beautiful, beautiful woman. And she looked at the bread. She took the bread, she tasted the bread, and said, "This is fine bread." And he said, "Will you marry me?" And she said, "No." But he talked and he persuaded her, and finally she said, "Maybe, but you'll have to meet my father first." and he gulped. And out of the water came the father. And he said, "You seem like a nice boy. It is possible you could marry my daughter, but you'll have to do a test." The two of them walked into the water and almost immediately came back out, and there were 4 of them. The father and 3 seemingly indistinguishable beauties. And he looked, and they were the same height, they had the same colour hair, they had the same coloured eyes, they had the same face. They were even wearing the same clothes. And he thought, only a 33 1/3%, because he was a clever boy, only a 33 1/3% chance of getting it right. What should I do? And as he was looking at them, one of the women in the middle just put her right foot forward. And as he looked down, all of them had bows on their feet, but she had a double bow. And she was smiling and confidently walked towards him and said, "This is my love." And the father said, "Okay, I will give you a dowry when you marry my daughter. As many beasts as she can name in one breath will come out of the lake and will be yours." And she took a big breath and she talked horses and cows and sheep and ducks. When she ran out of breath, all of these creatures came out of the water and followed her and her fiancé back to the farm. And they were married and they were happy. But the one thing that the father said as he turned to go was, "Have a happy life and a happy marriage, but if you strike my daughter without reason 3 times, she'll come back to me and you'll never see her again." This played on his mind and he was extra careful, and they lived and they had children. They had 3 sons, and these 3 sons grew into teenagers and young men. What could possibly go wrong? And so there was a wedding. They were invited as a local couple. And as they went to the wedding, she turned round and she said, "I've forgotten my white gloves. I need to go back." And he nudged her with his elbow and said, "You've had all this time to get ready and you've forgotten the gloves." And she said, "I won't go to a wedding without my gloves. That's the first time you've struck me without reason." And he went pale. And he said, "I'd rather cut off my hands than strike you again. Get your gloves. I'm sorry." And from that day on, he was even more careful. And the months passed, a year passed, and they were invited to a christening. I think it was the same couple had been married. And they went to the christening and everybody was happy. And there was the clergyman behind the font. And suddenly he turned round and his wife was weeping. Tears coming down her face with such a sad expression. And he nudged her and said, "Everybody's looking at you. This is a marvellous, happy occasion. Why are you embarrassing me?" And she said, "Because I know this child's life will be short and painful. I have the sight and I grieve for him, and that's why I'm crying. And that's the second blow you've given me." And he gasped and he said, "It will never happen again." And it didn't for quite some time. Until finally, there was a funeral of the child. That christened child had a short life of a few years, and he became sick and died. And everybody from the local area went to the funeral. And there was great sorrow. Until he looked at his wife, and she was laughing. She was smiling. She was laughing out loud. And he went, "What are you doing?" And she said, "The child, for the first time, is happy. It was in so much pain and is now free of pain. And that is the third time that you have struck me." And she turned and she walked out of the church. She walked across the fields. And as she got to the farm, all those animals that came out of the lake broke free of their tethers and followed her. He pleaded with her, but nothing would stop her. And she walked and walked, and she went into the lake and slowly disappeared, and all those animals followed her. And he followed them. He thought, if I cannot have her anymore in life, maybe I'll meet her again in death. He was never seen again. And the three young men, they were old enough to look after themselves, but of course they were devastated by the lack of their mother and father, and would often gravitate to that lake and look out. One day, their mother appeared, came out of the water and said, "I want you to live the best life. And I want to repay everybody for the happiness they gave me. So I will teach you medicine. I will teach you cures. I will teach you potions. I will teach you salves. And you will become physicians." And they did. They became the best physicians in Wales. And as they grew and married and had offspring, they taught them all these skills. And it's still known today in Wales that all the doctors and physicians all go back to those three young men. And that is the story of the Lady of the Lake. I hope you enjoyed it. Next time it will be Iris telling the story. Remember, it's a story that counts.